there, and welcome back to the ADF Architecture TV channel. My name is Ronald and I'm Director of Product Management in Oracle's Application Development Tools Division. In this series we're looking at the challenges and the science and the solutions behind building a strong user experience or UX for your ADF applications. In the last episode I discussed how we understand how a user uses an application, and in this episode I'm going to focus on a technique called wireframing, which is our first opportunity to give our end users or our stakeholders an idea of the user experience or the interaction patterns of that application. Now here at Oracle we spend a huge amount of time and effort building our Fusion applications, and we're often asked how that knowledge can be reused when it comes to you building your own applications. So how does Oracle build an application's user experience? The first and possibly most important thing is we observe the users. Most people think that visual design is all about the user interface. Do you like red buttons or green buttons? But no, instead it's about the user experience. What's the complete experience of your users when completing a task or a job? And it's important to look right across your global organization, since different people might work different ways due to local or cultural differences or nuances. At Oracle, when building Fusion applications, we went into the work environment and we looked at how users actually worked. How did they tackle a particular task? Did they have to collaborate with others in the department? And we looked at their work and the information, how that flowed across the organization. So remember, this wasn't just about what colours they liked for their buttons, but what was their experience of completing a business task. We then analysed and looked for usage activities or patterns. Why did they do something a particular way? Now a good example is we observed some users having post-it notes around their PC. So we looked to understand why users were using post-it notes. And in some cases this can be an indication of how memorable or usable an application really is. Do I use a post-it note to remind me how to navigate or complete a task? Do I use a post-it note as help? Or do I use a post-it note to jot down information which I then use in another application? And in fact, a user's reliance on things like post-it notes help us drive some UX patterns such as contextual actions and embedded help in Fusion applications. The third step, and the one will make up the main focus of this lesson, is an incredibly valuable technique for initial iterative visualization, and that's called wireframing. This is a low fidelity drawing that quickly begins to bring your application's user experience to life on paper or electronically, and that can be reviewed by the stakeholders. The key here is that it begins to close the gap between the intent and the action. Prototyping is the next step. This is different from wireframing in that you're moving from low fidelity conceptual drawings to actually implementing high fidelity functional pages. A prototype would typically be targeted at a testable specific user task which would look to validate, for example, the navigation and general user interaction. This of course builds on top of the lessons learned from your wireframing, since a prototype can take much longer to build than a wireframe. And through all of these cycles you're observing and you're measuring and you're reiterating as you work to improve the user's experience. So let's spend a little time looking at wireframing. As I said earlier, wireframing is an early step to help you and your stakeholders visualize your application's user experience. Importantly, it's getting initial buy-in from those who know the application, those who will be using it, and those people who have to build it as well. Now as a starting point you need to have some sort of functional spec outlining the user requirements and what the application is looking to achieve. And from that you're looking to output some low fidelity wireframe drawings. Now remember, this isn't all about colours, fonts, logos or cool animation. It's about exploring your page design. Does it provide the right information in the right places? It's about blueprints for your interaction. How do you search for information? How do you add data? How do you present multiple data records or rows of information to your users? It's also about navigation. Do you use pop-ups, maybe region navigation? Do you have a multi-tab browser model? Do you use tabbed content? How do I travel from one part of my application to the other? It's also about layout and components. Would you like to see a table of contextual data? Would you like to see some visual representations of information? Do you like where your action buttons or your navigation buttons are? And ultimately, it's about having something that your end users can sign off on and say, yes, that's the kind of application that I want. And if you want to see an example, this is one of Oracle's own actual wireframes from Oracle Fusion Financials. And guess why it doesn't represent what you finally saw in Oracle Fusion Financials General Ledger? Well, this is because the process is iterative. And this wasn't final. It was refined a few more times, but what it did do was it allowed the users to see how the application might interact and how information might be laid out. One additional point to make, and this is a good practice for wireframes, if you can see on the diagrams, the naming, the version control, owner information, annotations, flow arrows, all this helps in managing your wireframes. And here's another example, this time from an Oracle partner. Now immediately you can get user buy-in on the page layout, grouping of information, the fact that you have images presented as a carousel, and you can validate things like the menu choices that are available to the user. And now here you can see the prototype. Now remember, wireframes are low fidelity by design, and just compare that to the prototype. And here's another good example of a wireframe and the supporting prototype. In this case, for Fusion Applications journal entry, it took about 30 minutes or so to wireframe up this flow. Here the stakeholder can immediately give buy-in having seen the tabbed interaction pattern, the logical grouping of information, and the various navigation patterns. Now let's compare that to the prototype, which is much more high fidelity, and a result it took much longer to build. But from the prototype you have built on those patterns that were agreed in the wireframing, and now you're seeing a much closer representation to the finished article. So let's remind ourselves of what we're looking to achieve from wireframing. It's about getting quick initial buy-in from your users. They get to see things like how an application navigation will work, how content will be laid out, what kind of UI components you might use, and the interaction patterns for common actions. It's not about being visually perfect. In fact, having a low fidelity wireframe actually helps by not even trying to represent pixel perfection, colours or look and feel. And importantly, a wireframe wouldn't typically be developed using your end technology. It usually takes too long to do it that way. And that's what formal prototyping is really for. So how might you start developing these wireframes? Well, you could simply use a whiteboard or the back of an envelope, but for scale, tools such as MS Visio or Balsamic are pretty good options to consider. One feature of Visio is that we actually have ADF templates, which means you can get a close representation of the final UI. But on the flip side, with a tool like Balsamic, the fact that the drawings are almost cartoonish means your end users will be less tempted to focus on the details of colours and pixel perfection. In the end, you pay your money and you make your choice. And these are just two options that you might be considering. So what have we learned in this lesson today? Well, good UX doesn't just happen. You have to plan, you have to observe, you have to analyse and test your user interaction patterns. One of the important techniques in this cycle is wireframing, which gives you the ability to sketch out low fidelity page layouts and interaction and navigation blueprints. And this is a great way of getting stakeholder buy-in by allowing the users to visualize things like the flow and the application interaction. In the next episode covering usability and layout design, I'm going to be looking at some tips and tricks for building custom skins for your ADF applications. So thank you very much for watching ADF Architecture TV.